Number 3. Culver City Studios. The name Thomas Harper Ince often isn't on the tip of the tongue when it comes to classic stories about Hollywood, but it should be. Ince was a silent film actor turned film director in Tinseltown's earliest days and is often credited as the father of the Western. He also spent $500,000 out of his own pocket to help found and build Culver City Studios in 1918. The studio's 29 acres have played backdrop to countless films and TV classics in the centuries since. Movies like Citizen Kane, Raging Bull, and I Am Legend have all filmed there, as have such television series as Star Trek, Pee-wee's Playhouse, and Cougar Town. The studio's beautiful administration building, known as the Mansion, also served as Terra Mansion in Gone with the Wind. So now that we have Thomas Ince's studio's credentials out of the way, here's why most people perhaps aren't familiar with him. He died young and suddenly. On November 19, 1924, Ince boarded a yacht owned by his friend, William Randolph Hearst. Hearst was a powerful publishing magnate and famously the inspiration for Citizen Kane. But something, somehow, happened during that 3-hour tour, and when the ship returned to dock later that night, Ince's lifeless body was carried down the gangplank and put into a waiting car. He died early the next morning, 3 days after his 44th birthday. There are plenty of true crime theories that delve into what may have befallen the director that night, with everything from indigestion to a bullet to the head being the culprit. But the end result was the same. Ince was no longer among the living. Or, at least, that's what people assumed. Though Ince was cremated at the Hollywood Forever Cemetery, back at his studio, there were reports that he was still hanging around. Over the years, workers have said they've seen a ghostly image of Ince wearing a bowler hat, walking across the catwalks high above the sound stages. One of the men was so convinced by the image, he actually called out to the man, warning him about being up there. The ghost turned to the worker, frowned, and continued on down the catwalk before disappearing into a wall. In 1988, during extensive renovations to the studio grounds, the producer's ghost started to appear in and around the administration mansion, often seen climbing the stairs that once led to Ince's personal projection room. One day, during the demolition of some old structures on the lot, prop maker and special effects technician Eugene Hilchey brought his camera, determined to capture Hollywood history before it was bulldozed to the ground. Hilchey has gone on record saying that as he was about to take some photos, the air around him began to get very chilly, despite the fact that it was 80 degrees Fahrenheit. As he thought about going back to his car to get his jacket, Hilchey was shocked to encounter the ghost of Ince, who intoned, "I don't like what you've done to my studio," before vanishing again into the wall. Hilchey wasn't able to snap a shot of Ince that day. Perhaps the former actor wasn't ready for his close-up. Number 2. Granada Studios. Anyone who loves primetime serial dramas like Grey's Anatomy or Blue Bloods owes a debt of gratitude to Coronation Street. Launched on ITV in 1960, the British show was a direct influence on ABC when it created the first American primetime serial drama, Pain Place, in 1964. That show was so successful that other networks tried to copy it, and they have continued to try to do so even today. But unlike Pain Place, Coronation Street, or Corey as its fans call it, is still on the air 62 years after its debut. With such a long lifespan, it is perhaps understandable that some of the show's former castmates are no longer with us. And anything associated with so much death is bound to have a few spirits lurking about. One ethereal presence is said to be that of actress Pat Phoenix, who played sexpot Elsie Tanner on the show for 24 years. Phoenix died of lung cancer in 1986, but Corey creator Tony Warren swore for years after her death that Phoenix stayed around on the set long after her final curtain. "I would smell this great gale of perfume," Warren said, adding that his dogs, who would often go crazy when they were around Phoenix in life, would suddenly behave as if she was there again. Other castmates reported seeing a different, ghostly figure roaming the street with long dark hair and a long dark coat. And there were rumblings that perhaps the ghosts weren't simply harmless apparitions. In 2009, director and associate producer Kay Patrick was run over when a car driven by an actor mysteriously had its accelerator pinned to the floor. Perhaps the ghost was unhappy with Patrick's storyline that week. Luckily, she walked away with minor injuries. Still, not all of Coronation Street's ghosts have been associated directly with the show. During his first 53 years of production, Corey was filmed entirely at Granada Studios in Manchester, England. The production facility was purchased in the 50s by Granada TV from the city of Manchester for £82,000. A bargain, considering the site was the former resting place of more than 22,000 poor and indigent people who were buried there in paupers' graves. One studio tour guide reported to his bosses that he once saw a woman dressed all in white and wearing Victorian clothes as she accompanied a small child down to the set's famous cobblestone street. In 2013, the Granada Studios site was deemed unsuitable for the show's needs, and production was moved into a new facility called Media City, 2.5 miles away. Unwilling to demolish a historical site, however, ITV used the old set for a number of functions and events, even as the ghosts remained. In 2017, the studio hired a band to perform at a party, but then the musicians backed out after their warm-up sessions because they were spooked by a strange tingling sensation they got on stage. They were also worried about banging sounds coming from inside the walls and terrified after one of their pieces of equipment randomly exploded. The story was enough to scare two comedians into backing out of a presentation they had planned at the site of the old Rover's return. Ironic, since they were planning to tape a Halloween special at the time. According to the UK's Daily Mail, Granada spokesperson Christopher Wadsworth went as far to hire a Roman Catholic priest to perform an exorcism on the old soundstage to put everyone at ease. And it seemed to work. Now spiritually quiet, the studio sold the site to developers to turn it into a hotel. Yet, when the priest cast the ghosts and spirits from Granada Studios, some believe he sent them with the Corey Street cast and crew to their new location. Either that, or the show had to contend with a whole new set of spirits at Media City, which was built atop of Manchester's old Salford Quays shipyard, where countless dock workers lost their lives during its 88-year history. It sounds far-fetched, one crew member told the UK's Daily Mirror in 2015, but people were openly saying that the new site is haunted too. It seems Coronation Street's ghosts are as devoted to the show as its fans. Number 1. Stage 19. In the early 1990s, the sitcom Wings was one of the most popular shows in America. As part of NBC's legendary must-see TV lineup, it consistently landed good reviews for being smart and witty and decidedly grown-up show. In fact, unlike a lot of sitcoms at the time, the series didn't have a child actor in sight. No meddlesome neighbor kids, no cutesy cousins from out west, no rapidly aging babies who go from newborn to toddler in the span of a summer hiatus. No kids at all. So it was surprising when, while the show was being filmed, crew members who worked behind the scenes would often hear a child giggling. Usually at night, long after most folks had gone home. They would also hear the metallic patter of little feet coming from high above the soundstage and the catwalks where the lights and scenery were rigged. And there were some reports of people feeling a glancing tap on their lower back, even though there was no one there when they turned around. Then one day, while cutting together an episode's footage, an editor on Wings said he went white upon seeing a ghostly image of a little girl in the background of one of those scenes, even though no children had been cast in that week's episode. It seems that the set of Wings was haunted by poltergeists. The question was, to whom did the ghost belong? To understand that, paranormal researchers have pointed to the location of the Wings soundstage. It comprised the entire building on what's called Stage 19 of the Paramount Studios lot on Melrose Avenue in Hollywood. Ghost hunters immediately pointed to the fact that Paramount Studios shares a wall with the Hollywood Forever cemetery. As the resting place for countless of Hollywood's famous and infamous faces, the cemetery has long been the subject of reputed hauntings since it opened in 1899. One legendary ghost is silent film idol Rudolph Valentino, who is said to wander through the cemetery wall and onto the Paramount lot, perhaps in search of one last great role. But the wall adjacent to the cemetery is near Soundstage 31, across the lot from Stage 19. There have been no reported sightings of child ghosts in that particular area of the studio. Also working against the cemetery wall theory is the fact that the Stage 19 poltergeist didn't start to appear until around 1989 during the production of the film Ghost, starring Patrick Swayze, Debbie Moore, and Whoopi Goldberg, which was also filmed on Stage 19. The cast and the crew of that film reported some otherworldly goings-on while producing the movie. In addition to childlike giggles coming from the stage's rafters, gaffers reported inexplicable power outages in which bulbs would blink out even though they were just turned on, plugged in, and had fresh bulbs. They too were at a loss to explain who was haunting the place or why. But the fact that the hauntings only began during its production lends credence to the fact that the playful Stage 19 ghost was more of a recent addition to the afterlife. Searching Hollywood history for a tragic, untimely death of a child during the late 1980s brings up the sad story of child actor Heather O'Rourke. Most paranormal enthusiasts know the famed Playboy Curse, a series of tragic events that followed the making of the 1982 Steven Spielberg-produced film Poltergeist. Heather O'Rourke shot to fame after starring in the film and its subsequent sequels, only to die tragically from septic shock and heart failure at the age of 12 in 1988. Could the ghost of Heather O'Rourke be haunting the players on Stage 19 at Paramount? Critics are quick to say no way. Not only was Poltergeist filmed at MGM Studios, not Paramount, but O'Rourke passed away in a hospital in San Diego, 120 miles from Los Angeles. And she is not buried in Hollywood Forever Cemetery, but Westwood Memorial Park across town. But those who believe it is O'Rourke's spirit playing around in Stage 19 point to one of her early roles, that of Heather Feister, a character who appeared in the 1983-1984 season of Happy Days. During that year, O'Rourke appeared in 12 episodes of the sitcom as the daughter of actress Linda Pearl. Heather kept the child alive in herself and consequently in those she worked with, Pearl told CNN in 1988. Friends have said that of the 24 or so roles O'Rourke landed before the age of 12, she was happiest during her half season on Happy Days, especially during the scenes with the Fonz himself, Henry Winkler. She was professional, she was beautiful, and she wanted so badly to be a good actress, Winkler said upon her death. O'Rourke and Winkler were said to have grown very close to each other during the run of season 10 of Happy Days. Winkler even attended her funeral when she died, 4 years after Happy Days ceased production on Stage 19. Number 3. The Centerfold Curse. In January 1986, the football team for the University of Iowa, the Hawkeyes, were invited to Hugh Hefner's Playboy Mansion in Hollywood on the day after the Rose Bowl. But the visit wasn't a celebration, because during the game, the Hawkeyes got crushed by the UCLA Bruins. Oddly, this has happened to a sports team invited to frolic in the famed waterfall grotto. The year before, baseball's St. Louis Cardinals dropped by the mansion before promptly losing the World Series. And the year before that, the team from the University at Illinois got beat by UCLA in the Rose Bowl after a similar invitation from Hef. As Hefner himself said in 1986, there may be a curse here. Yet, while it's true there may be a curse involving Playboy, it has nothing to do with sports. In fact, it's far more deadly, because Playboy's Playmate models seem to die unexpectedly and young at an alarming rate. The most recent victim of the curse may be model Ashley Mattingly. She took her own life in 2020 at the age of 33. There have been a handful of Playmate suicides in the magazine's 69-year history. The 1958 Playmate, Cheryl Kubert, died by suicide in 1989 at age 51. As did 1964 cover girl Ashlyn Martin in 1991 when she was only 45. In 1974, 30-year-old Paige Young killed herself with a gun. As did 1981 model Debbie Boostrom in 2008 at age 53. Disease has also taken its toll, with at least 13 models succumbing to everything from cancer to colon blockages to asthma attacks. Car accidents also call Playboy alumni too, it seems. The most famous example is that of Jane Mansfield, who appeared in Playboy in 1955 and was killed in a car wreck 12 years later at only 34. Her 3-year-old daughter, Mariska Hargitay, would go on to TV stardom in Law & Order SVU. For years, rumors swirled that Mansfield had been decapitated in the wreck, which saw her car veer underneath a semi-truck. But that rumor turned out to be untrue. The Undertaker later said her head was attached as much as mine is. An accident of another kind ended the life of Eve Mayer, a Playmate from 1955. She was one of the 550 people who perished in the Tenor Life disaster, a runaway collision between two passenger jets in the Canary Islands in 1977. 8 years later, model and actress Carol Wayne, who regularly appeared in the popular Art Fern's Tea Time movie sketches on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, died by drowning in a mysterious incident that some still call suspicious. She was only 42 years old. The March 1967 issue of Playboy perhaps holds the distinction of being particularly cursed. That issue featured Fran Gerard, who appeared in the Miss March centerfold wearing glasses, a first for the magazine. Gerard died in 1985 at 37 under mysterious circumstances, with some speculating murder, while others insinuating it was suicide. Also in the March 1967 issue was a photo spread featuring actress Sharon Tate, who would be murdered by the Manson family only 2 years later. There were other Playmate murders as well. Dorothy Stratton was only 20 when she was shot and killed by her boyfriend in a jealous rage involving director Peter Bogdanovich. Her story was later made into 2 movies, one being Star 80 with actress Meryl Hemingway, who perhaps knows something about curses. The suicide of her grandfather, Ernest Hemingway, in 1961 kicked off what some call the Hemingway Curse. In 1997, Star Stowe, who posed for Playboy 20 years earlier, was found in some bushes behind a pharmacy in Coral Springs, Florida. She had been strangled, and her death is linked to the work of a Florida serial killer. As of 2022, the killer has not been caught. Perhaps the most frequent Playboy model's COD is OD. At least 7 women have found their end as the result of overdoses. 1992 centerfold Anna Nicole Smith was only 39 when she overdosed on sleeping pills in 2007, leaving her 5-month-old daughter behind. Between 1953 and 2015, there were 739 women who appeared in Playboy's infamous centerfold spread. Of those, 39 women all met untimely deaths, all before the age of 55. That's about a 5% mortality rate. So, what the hell is going on with Playboy Playmates? The answer may lie in the story behind the first death of a Playboy subject. The overdose, or was it murder, of Marilyn Monroe in 1862 when she was only 32. Monroe appeared in the magazine's very first issue in December 1953. However, she did not pose willingly. The magazine's founder, Hugh Hefner, purchased a number of nude snapshots of Monroe taken by a seedy photographer before she became a movie star, and have proceeded to publish them without Marilyn's permission or knowledge, a move that mortified the actress and threatened her career. I never even received a thank you from all those who made millions off the photos, she was quoted as saying in the book, Marilyn, Her Life in Her Own Words. I even had to buy a copy of the magazine to see myself in it. One could say that Playboy's entire enterprise was launched on the back of Marilyn Monroe's nude body, and by the unscrupulous hands of Hugh Hefner. When Hef died in 2017, he was interred at the Westwood Cemetery in Hollywood, in a crypt they bought directly next to Marilyn Monroe's, so that he and Marilyn would be side by side for eternity, despite the fact that he never even met her, and yet made a fortune off her without her consent. Perhaps the impetus for a deadly karmic curse, if there ever was one. Number 2. Demon vs. Rapper. Sometimes the victim of a curse may bring it upon themselves. Case in point, rapper Post Malone. Long a fan of the paranormal, in 2018, Malone accepted an invitation to appear on the television show Ghost Adventures. The episode featured a trip to Zach Bagans' Haunted Museum, a Las Vegas sideshow which houses Bagans' impressive collection of supernatural objects and dark memorabilia. Inside you'll find Charles Manson's television, the rocking chair that inspired the movie The Conjuring, and the transaxle supposedly once housed in the body of James Dean's ill-fated poor spider. Check out our video on 3 deadly haunted cars for more on that terrifying story. But one particular object in Bagans' vast collection is a Dybbuk box, a wine cabinet said to contain a demonic spirit from Jewish folklore. The story behind the box is a little murky, with the original owner, Kevin Manis, once recanting his version of its supernatural origin. Regardless, producer Sam Raimi did go on to produce a 2012 movie called Possession that is inspired by the Dybbuk box's demonic history. In 2016, Bagan purchased the box to add to his eclectic collection and continues to relate its story to anyone he specifically invites to see the box up close. The legend goes that there is a demon in the box that attaches itself to anyone who opens the box and peers inside. Then the demon stays with that person, waiting for the moment when that person commits a sin. Only after the subject of the demon's interest commits the sin can the demon gain enough spiritual strength to attack that person as a punishment. However, superstar Post Malone, who was facing the box when Bagan opened it during Ghost Adventures, the Dybbuk is probably not the type of demon you want to have on your shoulder. especially when you live the wildlife of one of the world's top music stars. According to the show's producer, at the moment Malone came in contact with the box, a glowing aura could be seen on the videotape of the encounter. Sensing enough was enough, Malone bolted from the room displaying the box. But perhaps the damage was already done. Malone's episode of Ghost Adventures was taped in June 2018. The first appearance of the Dybbuk demon occurred only weeks later when, according to Malone's friend DJ Smitty, the rapper began complaining of mysterious bite marks up and down his arm, even though he had been alone on his tour bus at the time. Malone began to suspect that the Dybbuk box had something to do with the bites, and his suspicions were confirmed on August 21, 2018, when the private Gulfstream jet Malone was flying in had two tires explode in flight, prompting a harrowing emergency landing as smoke filled the cabin. 2 weeks later, while driving in his Rolls-Royce Wrath, Malone was T-boned at an intersection in West Hollywood. And though he was not harmed, he was shocked to soon learn that while he was dealing with the fallout from the car accident, thieves broke into his former home. Malone was not there, but security cameras caught the thieves calling out for Malone and searching the house trying to find him, perhaps to do him harm. A year later, on New Year's Eve 2019, while performing live on ABC's Countdown show, Malone fell off the stage and into the crowd. After we opened this Dybbuk box, Malone told Seth Meyers in 2021, it was really odd stuff. Unfortunately for Malone, the odd stuff didn't stop there. Even 3 years after his experience with the Dybbuk box at Zach Bagans' museum, it seems Malone may still be haunted by the demon in charge of counting his sins. As recently as September 2022, Post Malone had to seek medical attention after falling into an open trap door on stage in St. Louis, Missouri. Doctors diagnosed him with a fractured rib and forced him to cancel his tour dates for a month. When he finally made it back on the stage in Atlanta, Georgia on October 19, 2022, Malone fell into yet another hole in the stage, this time twisting his ankle. In response to his woes since his encounter with the Dybbuk box, Malone once tweeted, "Why does God hate me?" The answer, however, may not lie with God at all, but rather a demon bent on retribution for his indiscretions. Number 1. Development Hell. The discovery came on a Wednesday. Around 4:30 p.m. on March 26, 1969, a police cruiser in Biloxi, Mississippi pulled up behind an idling automobile parked on the side of the road. As they got out to investigate, the cops immediately noticed a rubber garden hose attached to the vehicle's exhaust pipe, with the other end of the hose having been wedged in the driver's side window. The occupant of the car, who the coroner later said died by suicide, was 32-year-old Ken Toole. New Orleans officers soon knocked on the door of the home of the man's parents, who were overcome with grief. Their son, they said, had been on a road trip hoping to get over a bout of depression. Ken was a writer, his mother explained, and he had boxes of manuscripts in his room, but all of them had been turned down by publishers. One editor called his latest comic novel utterly pointless. It seems Ken just couldn't see a future in which he would become a published writer, which led him down that side road and into the afterlife. He had left his latest manuscript atop his dresser in his childhood bedroom at home. But Ken's mother, Thelma, had always believed in her son. She knew he was a great writer if only she could get his work into the right hands. Having left Ken's room exactly as he left it, Thelma eventually summoned the courage to pick up his last manuscript, collecting dust on his armoire. For the next 10 years, she wrote letter after letter trying to get the book published. Then, in the late 1970s, it finally landed on the desk of editor Walker Percy, who saw promise in the work. He polished it and printed it and sent it to bookstores. That novel, A Confederacy of Dunces, would win the Pulitzer Prize. And it would make Ken Toole, John Kennedy Toole, one of the most celebrated American authors of the 20th century, a decade after his death. The New Republic called it one of the funniest books ever written. So it's no wonder that even before the book hit stores, a young executive at Fox Studios, Scott Kramer, scooped up the film rights to Dunces. In turn, he got the king of late night, Johnny Carson, to come aboard as a producer. Johnny said that he thought the comedian Richard Pryor might be right to star. To Saturday Night alum John Belushi, however, that casting wasn't right at all. The main character in Dunces is Ignatius J. Riley, an overweight, overeducated, and underemployed 30-something. Not unlike Belushi himself at the time. He convinced Carson that he, not Pryor, should be the star of the film. And he almost got his wish. On June 9, 1980, Pryor set himself on fire while trying to freebase cocaine. Publicly, it was ruled an accident, but family members later said they believed it was a suicide attempt. With Pryor out of the picture, as it were, Belushi got himself cast as the 300-pound hero of Dunces. He even began to pack on pounds to more fit with Riley's described bulk. Then, in 1982, with filming scheduled to begin in New Orleans, Josine Bold, the director of Louisiana's Film Commission, was shot dead by her husband in a murder-suicide. As the Film Commission regrouped, the movie was temporarily put on hold, which gave John Belushi, who had a history of his own substance abuse, just enough time to overdose in Hollywood's Chateau Marmont Hotel at the age of 32. Soon after, Johnny Carson let his option on the script lapse, and the film went into what Hollywood insiders call development hell. Over the next few years, a few more attempts were made to get Dunces on film. Producer Steve Tisch picked up the rights in 1983. Sadly, his daughter would take her own life. Thumb O'Toole died in 1984 after an unexpected illness. In 1988, director John Waters was hired to direct a reimagined movie of the book. He even had his Ignatius, comic actor and singer Divine, star of his cult classic film Pink Flamingos. But Divine passed away suddenly in his sleep in March of that year. He was 42 years old. Putting the project's future in question. In 1993, Paramount Pictures bought the film rights to the book for upwards of $3 million and tapped Groundhog Day director Harold Ramis to head it up. Ramis thought that his old SCTV friend and co-star John Candy would make a perfect Ignatius. The Canadian comic actor had not only the heft, but the acting chops to do it. But Candy's sudden heart attack death just a year later put the movie back on the shelf. In the mid-90s, former NBC executive wunderkind Brandon Tartikoff came aboard as one of the film's producers. Thanks to his great relationship with NBC, he thought SNL superstar Chris Farley would be the perfect choice for the lead. Would Farley be interested in taking his first serial comic starring role? Farley was more than interested. But sadly, before production got any further, Tartikoff died of Hodgkin lymphoma in August 1997. He was 48 years old. 4 months later, Farley suffered his own overdose at the age of 33. A year later, Steven Soderbergh and Scott Rudin launched a lawsuit against Paramount over rights issues with the book. The suit languished in courts for years. Until around 2005, when the lawsuit was settled, plans were being made to restart the production of the film, starring another SNL alum, Will Ferrell. But the story of A Confederacy of Dunces is set in New Orleans. And Hurricane Katrina that summer decimated the city and many of the book's real-life locations. After that, the idea of turning Toole's book into a movie had been hanging around Hollywood for a quarter century. And by that time, the movie had so much bad mojo around it, no one could ever pull together enough money from financiers to get it going again. Harold Ramis, once a champion of the film, died unexpectedly in 2014 of an autoimmune disorder. As of 2012, it's estimated a confederacy of dunces has gone through no less than 24 producers, half a dozen scripts, and earned millions of dollars via rights and options. For believers that the film is cursed, however, they're happy to let well enough alone and leave this project in developmental hell, good and dead. And maybe that's what the spirit of John Kennedy Toole would have wanted after all. The deaths of Belushi and Candy add powerful aura to the curse, one of Dunce's many screenwriters, Stephen Fry, told The Guardian in 2018, which the life and unhappy death of its young author had already caused to surround the book. Maybe it's possible that the same demons that plagued Ken Toole in 1969 and caused him to take his own life are continuing to protect his legacy from the other side by ensuring that a possible film adaptation remains very much dead. Perhaps producers might do well to remember what author Stephen King once wrote in another kind of book: sometimes dead is better. Number 3. Adele. Adele has certainly had to deal with her fair share of unwanted attention and guests. That was the whole point of her renting a giant mansion in West Sussex in 2011. Adele was coming off having won awards, recognition, and major fame when she moved into her new home. But it seems like the unwanted guests found their way into her mansion. In 2011, Adele released her album, 21. The album, including the songs Rolling in the Deep, Set Fire to the Rain, and of course, Someone Like You, took over the charts. With 21, Adele won awards at the American Music Awards, the Billboard Awards, the Brit Awards, and the Grammy Awards. And this was only her second album. It was her follow-up to 2008's album, 19. And while 19 served as an excellent debut album for the young singer, 21 brought Adele a higher level of fame and attention that greatly surpassed anything she experienced the first time around. In fact, the paparazzi in London were after her so much that they were waiting outside of her home to get a glimpse of her. Adele was looking for a way to deal with the fame and attention she was receiving due to the success of her album. This is what brought her to a mansion in West Sussex. The mansion, named Lock House, was built in 1900 and it is styled in the 1930s Art Deco look. The house has a long history, even once serving as a convent. The mansion has 10 bedrooms, 7 bathrooms, and 8 reception rooms. And if you think the indoors is the only amazing part of this property, you would be wrong. The mansion is surrounded by 25 acres of land and actually has views of South Downs National Park. It includes 2 swimming pools, tennis courts, and even a helicopter pad. Not only that, but there are also electric gates. You think that Adele would be completely comfortable and completely safe. How could anyone infiltrate the security of this property? And for about $20,000 a month in rent, you think there'd be nothing to worry about. Well, as in many ghost stories, the call was coming from inside the house. And unfortunately, electric gates are useless in those cases. In 2012, Adele gave Anderson Cooper a tour of the mansion during an interview. While showing him around, she first stated that this house is a bit of a cliche really, before walking down a dark hallway after telling Anderson Cooper that it used to be a convent, saying, "This bit's all quite scary really." Anderson Cooper responded, You ever see The Shining? So it seemed he agreed that the mansion was somewhat creepy. Throughout the tour, Cooper acknowledges that there's hardly any furniture in the mansion, while also detailing that the house has 9 more bedrooms than Adele really needs. Adele mentions that there are full wings of the mansion that she doesn't use at all. A huge old mansion built at the turn of the 20th century with a large percentage unused and empty, and a history of being used as a convent sounds like a recipe for a haunting. So what supernatural events did Adele experience in this mansion? She heard unexplained noises, and a friend reported that Adele said that the mansion gave her the creeps. This was apparently due to the noises she heard at night. The noises included sounds of falling items, but Adele wasn't able to find these fallen items. Adele was so convinced that the place was haunted, and even wondered if its religious history had anything to do with it, she became too afraid to be there on her own, especially at night. To deal with her fear, she hired a bodyguard to live with her, and 2 more bodyguards to stand guard outside. Clearly, whatever it was scared Adele enough for her to leave the mansion entirely after living there for around a year. While the mansion seemed like a perfect place, considering it gave Adele her privacy in the lap of luxury, it seems that the unwanted guests made it unlivable for her. No number of bodyguards, sleeping over or otherwise, seemed to be enough for the singer to stay there forever. Number 2. Brad Pitt. Brad Pitt has become one of the most recognizable faces in Hollywood. One of his early roles in Thelma and Louise established him as a heartthrob, but later, roles in Legends of the Fall, 7, 12 Monkeys, and Fight Club established Pitt as a dramatic lead, and Ocean's 11 and Mr. and Mrs. Smith highlighted Pitt's comedic side. Pitt also has an illustrious producing career with his production company, Plan B, with a roster of award-winning films, including Troy, 12 Years a Slave, If Beale Street Could Talk, and Vice. Pitt's career goes far back and has been steady ever since. There's probably only one possession that has been with him since the beginning: his home. Pitt moved into his home, which is called Craftsman or Briarcliff Manor, in 1994. The property was originally 5,600 square feet and is situated in Los Feliz, Los Angeles. Over the years, Pitt had renovations done on the house and expanded the property. Now the entire property is 80,000 square feet. The home has 6 bedrooms, 7 bathrooms, and Pitt added a water slide, pool, bouncy house, and skate park. Many of these changes were to accommodate the needs of his growing family, as the home was purchased soon after he started seeing success in his movie career, but before he had a brood of kids to keep entertained. Interestingly, like Pitt, the house has its own Hollywood history. While it was built for an oil baron in 1910, the house was also owned by Mark Hamill in the 1960s. Hamill is of course best known for playing the role of Luke Skywalker in the Star Wars movies. In fact, Hamill lived in the house when one of the tragic events occurred. It was while living at Briarcliff that Hamill's roommate took his own life. And unfortunately, that's not the only tragic event to have taken place in the home. There is also another story that a member of the Ziegfeld Follies, a theatrical revue troupe, was found dead in the pool. This was not known to Cassandra Peterson when she purchased the house. Pearson is an actress who has been working in film and television since the 1970s, with her most famous role as Elvira in Elvira, Mistress of the Dark. Given that her most famous role is the Mistress of the Dark, you would think that a haunted mansion would be exactly what she was looking for. Alas, this is a reminder that actors aren't always the same people that they portray on screen. Pearson recounted that she had many unwanted ghostly guests make themselves at home there. The unwanted house guests started making themselves known immediately after Pearson moved in. The first encounter with them occurred while she was moving in. When moving boxes, Pearson asked the movers not to go to the third floor. She then heard footsteps on the third floor and went up to confront the movers. However, the movers were nowhere to be seen. And the spookiness didn't end there. Pearson even claimed to have seen 2 ghosts. She said that they looked so real that she spoke to them until they disappeared before her very eyes. One particularly creepy encounter was with a ghost who seemed to be dressed as a nurse from the 1930s. The ghost told Peterson that she was going to take her husband into the pool. Peterson was terrified to the point where she not only had a Native American shaman clear the place, but also invited a Catholic priest over as well. Unfortunately for Pearson, but fortunately for Pitt, Pearson couldn't deal with the otherworldly interactions she was having and decided to leave. She sold the house to Pitt in 1994 for $1.7 million. Apparently, the ghost stories were a major attraction for Pitt. Unlike for many people, they contributed to his decision to buy the home. Luckily, or perhaps unluckily, Brad Pitt hasn't experienced any ghostly encounters himself while living there. Perhaps it was the sad and disturbing history of the house that caused Pearson's ghostly interactions while living there. I suppose we will never know. That is, unless Brad Pitt comes forward with new stories. Number 1. Britney Spears and Britney Murphy. The final entry on this list includes 1 house and 2 Britneys. Britney Spears and Britney Murphy were 2 stars in the late 1990s and early 2000s. While Spears dominated the pop music scene with hits like Baby One More Time, Oops, I Did It Again, and I'm a Slave for You, Murphy was starring in some of the most popular movies, including Clueless, Girl Interrupted, and 8 Mile. While it doesn't appear as though the 2 crossed paths at the height of their careers, they do have one fairly significant experience in common. They both lived on Rising Glen Road in a gigantic home. The home is situated at the top of the Sunset Strip. At 10,000 square feet, the house seemed like the perfect place for the Hollywood stars to call home. However, the house had its own tragedy before reaching its own end. Could a Reiki healer be responsible? The house was first lived in by Spears. Spears lived there with her then boyfriend, pop star, and former member of NSYNC, Justin Timberlake. And it's here that the Reiki healer became involved. It would seem that before the fateful day, Spears had no issues at all with the home. One day, after a particularly eventful party weekend, Spears had a Reiki healer come over. After he finished his treatment, Spears felt a shift in the home. Julianne Kay, who formerly served as Spears' makeup artist, claimed that Spears contacted her to tell her that the Reiki healer opened some spirit portal or something. And it would turn out that these spirits weren't particularly friendly. Kay continued, these bad spirits had come in, and Spears was convinced they were trying to push her down the stairs or something crazy. Spears' feeling about these spirits was so strong that she told Kay that she couldn't stay in the house. She immediately went to Casa Del Mar Hotel and never returned to Rising Glen Road. Either Murphy was unaware of these happenings or wasn't concerned because she and her husband, Simon Monjack, moved into the home in 2003. While they lived there for 6 years together, it wouldn't be a happy time for the couple. In the documentary, What Happened, Britney Murphy, it is revealed that friends and family members were worried about Murphy's relationship with Monjack. In fact, people close to Murphy held an intervention with her prior to her marriage, hoping to convince her not to go through with it. It's alleged that Monjack was a very controlling husband and cut Murphy off from friends and family during the course of their marriage. Regrettably, the ending of their story is just as sad. In 2009, at the age of 32, Murphy collapsed in the Rising Glen Road home in her bathroom. She had been suffering from pneumonia and flu-like symptoms in the days leading up and had to be rushed to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. Unfortunately, Murphy passed away as a result of her symptoms. In a scary and yet odd turn of events, her widowed husband also passed away in the home only a few months later. He had similar symptoms to Murphy. There have been speculations over the years that Murphy and Monjack perhaps had illegal drugs in their systems, but the coroner found no illegal drugs in Murphy's system at the time of her death. In fact, they only found prescription and over-the-counter medications in her autopsy. Due to the strangeness of Murphy and her husband both dying within months of each other in the same house with the same symptoms, many theories have developed as to what the real cause of death could be. One hypothesis is that there was mold found in the home. However, mold was later dismissed as the culprit by the medical examiner. Another, more disturbing theory suggests that they were poisoned by Murphy's own mother, Sharon Murphy. This has been dismissed by many as unlikely, as Sharon and Britney were incredibly tight and had a great relationship. The exact cause of death remains a mystery to this day, because many people are skeptical that Murphy died of pneumonia. However, Monjack reported that, like Spears, Murphy found something off about the mansion on the top of Sunset Strip. He claims that she thought that the home was unlucky and absolutely hated the Rising Glen house. She even went as far to ask her husband to stay at the Beverly Hills Hotel rather than stay in their home. Murphy wanted to move away entirely. She was even making plans to move the family, including her husband and her mother, to New York that following year. Sadly, she wouldn't have that opportunity. Ultimately, whatever evil forces Spears and Murphy felt in their home are no longer there. The entire house was demolished in 2013. A new home was built in its place and sold in 2017 and again in 2020. Of course, this hasn't ended the speculation of what could have caused Murphy and Monjack's deaths. Those theories will likely live on much longer than the house ever did. Number 3. The Lives of the Stars. In 1983, actress Shirley MacLaine could count 10 Golden Globe nominations and 5 Oscar nominations on her resume. She was one of Hollywood's most versatile and well-respected performers. But that all changed in 1983 when MacLaine released her autobiography, Out on a Limb. In it, MacLaine laid out her metaphysical beliefs in UFOs, contact with the afterlife, and even reincarnation. She claimed that she had been a prostitute in one of her many lives, while in another she said she was executed by the King of France. Almost immediately, Shirley became a punchline to any number of jokes by stand-ups and late-night hosts. "Shirley, you can't be serious," they would ask. David Letterman made her feel so uncomfortable with his kneeling questions that she famously had to be bleeped by the censors in her response. But what Letterman and the comics didn't get was at the time of her past lives revelations, a nationwide poll revealed that 23% of Americans also believed in reincarnation. MacLaine's book went on to become a bestseller before it was turned into a highly rated TV movie. A year after its publication, Shirley MacLaine won an Oscar and a Golden Globe for her role in the film Terms of Endearment. But many may not realize, including MacLaine herself, was that she was just walking a path paved by another well-respected actor, Glenn Ford. In 1958, the Motion Picture Herald newspaper called him the #1 box office star in America. Only after his star had faded a little by the late 1960s did Ford begin quietly talking about his experiences with past lives. But even then, thanks to his stoic cowboy persona, absolutely nobody was laughing at him. In 1968, Ford let it slip to a gossip columnist over lunch that he'd recently undergone hypnosis. The reason, he admitted, was because he didn't believe in all the hocus-pocus surrounding reincarnation and metaphysics. But he was researching the topic for a potential film role as famed Dutch clairvoyant Peter Herkos. So it was with a healthy dose of skepticism that he visited Dr. Maurice Benjamin in Los Angeles in 1967. With a team of doctors from the UCLA Medical Center present, Dr. Benjamin put Ford under, and what resulted shocked everyone involved. During one hypnosis session, the audio of which was recorded, Ford began speaking in a thick Scottish brogue. He said his name was Charles Stewart, who was a music teacher from Elgin, Scotland, circa 1800. During the session, Ford got up from the couch and sat at a baby grand piano in the corner. Then he began playing like an expert. Movements by Mozart and Beethoven, no less. I was astonished, Ford said upon hearing the tape played back to him. I didn't believe it, because I could not play the piano, not a note. A later genealogical search revealed that music teacher Charles Stewart is, indeed, buried in Elgin Cathedral Cemetery in Scotland. During another session, Ford revealed, while speaking fluent French, that he'd been an officer in the elite French cavalry of Louis XIV, circa 1670. Records also show this officer, named Emile Legvin, had been killed in a duel in 1684. Though he spent his first 10 years in Quebec, Canada, Ford's grasp of the French language was rudimentary at best, and yet there, as Legvin, the actor was speaking fluent French. A professor in UCLA's language department later confirmed that Ford's accent was one of Parisian French from the 17th century, not French-Canadian. What was the memory of being part of the cavalry in a past life that most intrigued Ford? Growing up in Canada, Ford said he had never rode horses until he moved to California at age 10. Even then, I had the feeling I'd been on a horse before, Ford said. Reincarnation was the only explanation. By the age of 14, he was already an accomplished rider. So much so that led to him being cast as the go-to young cowboy and stunt rider in Hollywood westerns. And the rest was Hollywood history. As we said, these hypnosis sessions with Ford and Dr. Benjamin were recorded, and the audio was transcribed for a 1980 book by H.N. Banerjee called Americans Who Have Been Reincarnated. For his part, Glenn Ford was unlike Shirley MacLaine in that he didn't want all the attention he inadvertently brought to his past life experiences. Before his death at age 90 in 2006, he declined to talk about it further, citing a conflict of interest. Religion plays an integral part in my life, he said. I don't know what I would do without it, but this is totally conflicting with my beliefs. And one can't help but feel that Ford was actually shaken by the revelations, as he said, "It's as though I pulled the curtain away from something, and I've seen something I shouldn't have seen." Number 2. The Actor and the Author. In the summer of 1972, Tony Hopkins was in a bad place. Living in London, England, he had recently divorced his wife of 6 years and was hitting the bottle pretty hard. Though he had had some success acting in British films, calls from Hollywood weren't coming in yet. In other words, Tony Hopkins wasn't yet Sir Anthony Hopkins. All this is to say, Hopkins knew he needed to get serious about his craft and step up his game. He needed to show U.S. producers he had range. So when his agent called to tell him of a potential comedy, Hopkins was all ears. The role, it turned out, was the girl from Petrovka. a light comedy about an American journalist who falls for a budding ballet dancer in Moscow. It was based on the novel by American journalist George Pfeiffer, which hit the bookstores in early 1971. Wanting to pour himself into the role, Hopkins set out for a bookstore on Charing Cross Road in London to pick up a copy of the book. But the shop owner said that the book had only been released in the US and was not yet available in the UK. Hopkins was prepared to head home empty-handed. As he walked down the platform of the Leicester Tube station, he thought about how he might order a copy from America. Hopkins then sat on a bench and looked over to see a binder-bound manuscript next to him. Flipping through it, he grew astonished to realize it was a galley edition of The Girl from Petrovka. Now, in the book world, a galley is a loose-leaf copy of a book printed so that the author can make revisions before publication. The galley Hopkins found that day was noted with red marker in the margins. But this was no matter to the actor. He found the book. His prayers had been answered. Hopkins went home and devoured the text. His preparation helped him land the role in the film. Released in 1974, The Girl from Petrovka was produced by Universal Pictures and co-starred American actors Goldie Hawn and Hal Holbrook. Hopkins' role helped him catch the eye of other Hollywood producers, and work soon came pouring in from across the pond. So much so that Hopkins had to move to California only a few years after the movie was released. Something he had always dreamt of. But that isn't the end of the story. A year after Hopkins found the galley of the novel on that subway platform, he traveled to Vienna to film The Girl from Petrovka. Unbeknownst to Hopkins, also on the film set during those first days was George Pfeiffer, the author of the book upon which the film was based. Pfeiffer had been commissioned to write a magazine article about the filming of his novel, but he was nervous and not used to being on a film set. He literally bumped into Hopkins, and the two struck up a conversation. When Pfeiffer told Hopkins he was the movie's writer, the actor told the author about the trouble he had finding a copy of the book in London. Pfeiffer apologized. It was his fault the UK edition of the book had been delayed. It turned out that Pfeiffer had been staying in London's Hyde Park Square and was in the middle of editing his book for the UK market, adding the use of labor and neighbor and etc. One day, against his own better judgment, he lent his marked-up copy to a friend, who then reported the book was in the back seat when his car was stolen. Pfeiffer's editor's copy had disappeared. It was an oddly painful loss, the author said, that seemed to jinx the book. Upon hearing the story, Hopkins went to his dressing room and came back with the binder-bound galley he'd found on the Leicester Square Tube station bench the year before. Might this copy have some personal meaning to you? Hopkins asked. As Pfeiffer leafed through the pages, he was astonished to discover it was the galley that had gone missing, complete with his editing marks and notations written in the margins with red marker. While this story may sound too bizarre to be true, it comes from Pfeiffer himself. In 1974, the London Sunday Times ran an article discussing coincidences and asked readers to share their own weird stories. Pfeiffer wrote to the Times about his experiences with Hopkins and his book. Pfeiffer's letter was published and caught the eye of renowned author Arthur Koestler. It inspired Koestler to write a scholarly examination of the phenomenon of synchronicity called The Roots of Coincidence, an excursion into parapsychology. A couple years later, the Saturday Review magazine decided to profile Koestler for an upcoming issue. The freelance journalist they hired to write the piece was George Pfeiffer. By the mid-80s, Anthony Hopkins had grown tired of Hollywood and moved back to London to continue his film career. In 1986, he was cast in a British film as the owner of a bookshop on Charing Cross Road, the same place he first saw a copy of The Girl from Petrovka 15 years earlier. Number 1. Nightmare on Whittier Street. In the early hours of November 16, 2010, PR publicist to the stars, Ray Chasen, was driving home to Beverly Hills from a Hollywood movie premiere. As she turned onto North Whittier Drive, however, Chasen was unknowingly driving smack dab into the Twilight Zone. As she turned from Sunset Boulevard, 4 gunshots rang out. Chasen was hit in the chest and the back. She slumped over the steering wheel as her car drifted another half block down Whittier before it slammed into a concrete pole. When police arrived, they found Chasen dead from her wounds. The victim, they said, of a carjacking or robbery gone wrong. The police didn't realize at the time, though, that they had only looked up and around the area where Chasen was discovered. They would have been in line of sight to at least 5 other terrible tragedies, all within a stone's throw of Chasen's crumpled Mercedes E350. Ray Chasen was found at 1815 North Whittier Drive. 44 years earlier, 2 houses down at 807 North Whittier, an auto calamity of another kind occurred. On April 2, 1966, Jan Berry, of the famed surf rock duo Jan and Dean, known for their song Dead Man's Curve, slammed his car into a parked truck along the street. Berry spent 2 months in a coma after the accident and suffered partial brain damage and paralysis when he woke up. As he hitched up Berry's mangled Corvette, it's likely the tow truck driver was keeping an eye out for Paul Newman, who lived less than a block away. So he probably had no idea that he was only 20 yards away from a horrible crime scene from 11 years before. On February 9, 1955, 71-year-old Katie Hayden was found in a bloody heap on the kitchen floor of her mansion at 817 North Whittier. According to the coroner, Katie had been the victim of no less than 20 axe blows to the head and the face. The Hayden's cook, Margaret Moore, confessed to the murder, which was the result, she said, from an argument the two had over how to bone a roast. When the newspapers reported the story, they reported that Katie Hayden's murder occurred directly across the street from another sensational Beverly Hills crime. 8 years earlier, on June 20th, 1947, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel was famously gunned down in his living room during a mob hit. Standing outside the bay window, the gunman hit Bugsley with 4 rounds from a .30 caliber carbine. Siegel's death and life was later chronicled in the movie Bugsy, starring Warren Beatty, who also happens to be Shirley MacLaine's little brother, by the way. Siegel's murder happened in the living room of his 7,000 square foot mansion at 810 North Linden Drive, 5 doors down from the Hayden place. Siegel's neighbors, including actor Charles Boyer at 802 North Linden, could practically see the crime scene from his upstairs window. Incidentally, Boyer would eventually take his own life in 1978. At 723 North Linden Drive, police were called to a mansion owned by oil tycoon William Jettle. On May 9, 1934, Jettle was playing Gatsby, day drinking out by his pool, when 2 hooded men stormed his backyard with guns drawn. They forced the millionaire into a car and took him to a secluded area where he was bound and gagged for 6 days while the kidnappers demanded $60,000 ransom. Who knows what would have happened to the husband and father and 4 were not for 2 enterprising officers who tracked down the hideout and rescued Jettle. Eventually, guilty pleas sent the 2 abductors to San Quentin. It was 6 years after Jettle's kidnapping, another millionaire businessman found himself in a heap of trouble in Beverly Hills. Well, actually over Beverly Hills. On July 7, 1946, inventor and aviator Howard Hughes was behind the yoke of an experimental spy plane called the XF-11 when something went wrong. As the plane lost altitude, pilot Hughes tried to steer away from the mansions in Beverly Hills to crash instead on the golf course next to the neighborhood. But it wasn't to be. As famously recreated in the 2004 Martin Scorsese film The Aviator, Hughes' plane slammed into a group of homes. clustered around 808 North Whittier Drive. Right into the middle of what paranormal researchers have taken into calling the Beverly Hills Triangle. 3 mansions suffered damage in the crash, with a 4th home bursting into flames. Hughes barely survived the crash, and some say he was never the same after it. 5 terrible events occurring in such a tiny enclave has led some to speculate about 90210 Curse, and has led others to speculate, us included, that unlike the song by Weezer, maybe Beverly Hills is not where you want to be, after all. You'd never really think a long speech, prison time, and a hangover would have anything in common, but you'd be wrong. This video is all about random ways that different people manage to escape death and live to tell the tale. Number 3. Teddy Roosevelt. Although we've never really heard of a really long speech doing more than bore people to death, it turns out that Teddy Roosevelt's approximately 50-page speech saved his life. The year was 1912 and Roosevelt was on the campaign trail. He was vying for a 3rd term in a newly created party called the National Progressive Party, which was also known as the Bull Moose Party. Roosevelt had previously served as a Republican. This time the Republican candidate was William Howard Taft, who was trying to get re-elected. Roosevelt, unhappy with the work that Taft was doing, decided to run against him. They were both running against the Democratic candidate, Woodrow Wilson. On October 14, 1912, while on the campaign trail, Roosevelt was having dinner at the Gilpatrick Hotel in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. When entering his car just after 8 p.m., which was a convertible, Roosevelt waved to the crowds of people waiting for him. He was on his way to deliver the aforementioned 50-page speech. About 5 feet away from him was a man named John Schrank. Schrank was 36 years old and had previously worked in New York City as a saloon keeper, but at the moment he was unemployed. Schrank had followed Roosevelt's campaign through 8 states, and it wasn't because he was a fan. Schrank had followed Roosevelt with the express purpose of murdering him. And that's just what he attempted to do as he stood 5 feet from Roosevelt and he pulled the trigger on his .38 caliber gun. The bullet hit Roosevelt in the chest. Schrank tried to fire again, but he couldn't take another shot as the crowd turned on him. Roosevelt's stenographer, Albert Martin, was able to grab a hold of Schrank. Now, we're not sure what you're picturing in your mind for what a stenographer looks like, but this particular stenographer used to be a football player. So grabbing Schrank and putting him in a half Nelson was likely easier for Martin than any other stenographer. The crowd became angry and wanted Schrank dead, but shockingly, Roosevelt, who seemed unharmed, wanted to speak with Schrank. When Schrank wouldn't respond to him, Roosevelt reportedly said, "Oh, what's the use? Turn him over to the police." Although Roosevelt wasn't completely unharmed, he was much better than you would imagine of someone who had just been shot. Well, it turns out that the bullet hit right where his 50-page speech was in his pocket. However, it was not only the speech which helped block the bullet, his eyeglass cases and his heavy overcoat both added to his padding. Although Roosevelt was bleeding, he still wanted to deliver his speech. His handlers were, understandably, worried about him continuing without seeking proper medical attention, but Roosevelt was determined that he would continue. He reportedly said, "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose," which is a clever nod to the nickname of the newly formed party, the Bull Moose Party, and, let's be honest, it would have served as a great campaign slogan. I wonder if anyone made hats. Roosevelt, someone who was familiar with guns and gunshot wounds due to his hobbies and time as an officer during the Spanish-American War, felt he was fine to continue as he touched his fingers to his mouth to see if there was any blood. With the absence of blood, Roosevelt felt that the bullet didn't puncture his lung and he was likely fine to continue. As he stood to give his speech, the crowd was reasonably suspicious that he was feigning his injury. The days way before social media meant that the crowd waiting for him was immediately watching videos and seeing the reactions to the assassination attempt that happened prior to his arrival. However, Roosevelt quelled those suspicions by showing the crowd the blood on his shirt. Not only that, but there was a hole in his papers where the bullet went through. Roosevelt gave his speech and spoke for over an hour. However, surviving an assassination attempt and giving his speech for 84 minutes wasn't enough to convince the American population to elect him president again. The Democratic candidate, Woodrow Wilson, won, with Roosevelt receiving 27% of the vote. Many have surmised that he split the Republican vote with Taft. So, the last question is, why? Why did Schrank want to kill Roosevelt? Well, luckily for historians, Schrank had a document which outlined his motives on him. Schrank had two dreams in which the previous president, William McKinley to be exact, visited him. McKinley had been assassinated while in office, and his vice president, yes, you guessed it, Theodore Roosevelt, became president in his place. Apparently, Schrank had two dreams that featured McKinley. The first was in 1901, in which McKinley told Schrank that Roosevelt had killed him. Schrank's second dream, in September 1912, included a more direct message from McKinley, in which he tapped Schrank on the shoulder and asked him to avenge his death. Schrank also reportedly said that any man who seeks a third term, which Roosevelt was doing, should be killed. So his motives, although unusual, were very clear. After his trial, Schrank spent the rest of his life in the Central State Mental Hospital in Wisconsin. So the next time someone has a super long speech that is boring you to death, remember, it may save someone's life. Number 2. Louis Auguste Luger Silbaris. It's not often that someone credits prison as a lifesaver in the immediate sense of the word. We're sure that there are people who say that being sent to prison saved them in some sense in the long run, but not really in the short run. All we're saying is that, most of the time, prison is considered a negative. But not for Louis Auguste Silbaris, also known as Luger. Luger was born on the Caribbean island of Martinique in the year 1875. Luger was a felon and was arrested on May 7, 1902, after getting into a fight. Not only was he in prison, but he was put into solitary confinement, which was partly underground. It seemed his luck had run out that day. However, this turned out to be extremely serendipitous timing for Luger, because the next day, May 8, 1902, the volcano Mount Pelée erupted. It destroyed everything within an 8-mile radius and killed between 30 to 40,000 people in Saint-Pierre, Martinique. The entire city burned. The eruption was the deadliest eruption of the 20th century, and ash from the volcano traveled over a 50-mile radius. The hot gases from the volcano moved at 420 miles per hour, which would have been impossible to outrun. However, Luger survived. He was found 4 days later when he was heard yelling for help. His survival was attributed to the fact that he was in solitary confinement, which, as we mentioned, was partially underground. When he saw ash flying in through the small slit, which was the only outside access to his cell, he covered the hole with his clothes that he soaked in his own urine. Still, he was burned and in pain, and the air in his cell was over 1,000 degrees, but he did survive, although he was badly scarred. Luger used the situation to his advantage. He was pardoned for his crimes and ended up touring with Barnum and Bailey. Luger was identified as the most marvelous man in the world and the man who lived through Doomsday. This was all based on the story that he was the only survivor. However, that wasn't entirely true. There are reports of sailors who were on the water at the time who survived. Another name on the record was Javiera de Arifel, who was a child at the time of the eruption who was able to row to a cave. Leon Capre Landre also survived the eruption. He was on the outskirts of the city when the volcano erupted. He disappeared from public life not long after being found alive. But, in fairness to Barnum and Bailey, Luger did have an incredible story. One part of the story that is often questioned is, was Luger really in jail for a fight, or was it something more? This question arises because Luger was put in solitary confinement, something that is reserved for terrible crimes, like murder. Would someone really be put in solitary confinement for a fight? Luckily for Luger, there was no one there to dispute his reason for being in jail, and no documents survived either. Who knows if Luger really became a changed man after winning his second chance at life after the eruption, but he was clearly lucky enough that he wasn't a changed man before the eruption. Number 1. Celebrities on 9/11. The attacks of September 11, 2001 in the United States remain one of the most shocking and horrific in American history. Many remember exactly where they were on the day of the attacks. The enduring legacy of the attacks changed airport procedures, spurred 2 wars, and altered global politics in many ways. There were 4 planes that were hijacked by terrorists on September 11th. The first was American Airlines Flight 11, which flew into the North Tower, one of the Twin Towers, in New York City around 8:46 a.m. It hit floors 93 to 99. Around 17 minutes later, at 9:03 a.m., United Air Flights 175 hit the South Tower, hitting floors 77 to 85. Together, both towers had 16,400 to 18,000 people inside them. Both towers collapsed soon afterwards, and the debris from the collapse devastated the area. Then, at 9:45 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. And finally, a 4th flight was hijacked. That was United Flight 93. However, unlike the other flights, this one was delayed from taking off on time. Therefore, many people heard from friends and relatives about the news of the other attacks. The passengers were determined that their flight wasn't going to crash into another building, and they fought the hijackers. The plane crashed into a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania at 10:10 a.m. Everyone on board died. However, the target of the plane was never reached. Many people wonder if the target was the White House, but we'll probably never know for sure. Altogether, around 2,977 people were killed. This includes 2,753 people who were killed in the attacks on the towers in New York City, 184 who were killed at the Pentagon, and the 40 people on Flight 93. 2 people who were meant to be on the first flight that hit the North Tower, American Airlines Flight 11, were Seth MacFarlane and Mark Wahlberg, both of whom were intending to take that flight, but couldn't at the last minute. Seth MacFarlane, creator and star of Family Guy, and star and director of A Million Ways to Die in the West, went out drinking the night before his flight. When he woke up, he was hungover. Also, his travel agent wrote the wrong time on his itinerary. She wrote that the plane was taking off 10 minutes later than its actual takeoff time. As a result, he was 10 minutes late and missed the plane. Mark Wahlberg, the star of films like Uncharted and The Fighter, was also meant to be on American Airlines Flight 11 that fateful morning. He ultimately changed his mind and decided to go to a film festival in Canada instead. He was actually quoted as saying, "If I was on that plane with my kids, it wouldn't have went down like it did. There would have been a lot of blood in that first-class cabin, and then me saying, okay, we're going to land somewhere safely, don't worry." Of course, there was an outcry to the statement, and he even took it back later, saying, "To speculate about such a situation is ridiculous to begin with, and to suggest I would have done anything differently than the passengers on the plane was irresponsible. I deeply apologize to the families of the victims that my answer came off as insensitive. It was certainly not my intention." While those 2 famous Bostonians survived the flight that crashed into the Twin Towers, a king should have been at the top of one of those towers that day. The king of pop, Michael Jackson, was scheduled to have a meeting that day, but overslept that morning. The previous night, Michael was on the phone with his mother, Catherine, and his sister, Rebby, into the early morning hours of that tragic day. Jermaine Jackson wrote in his book, "You Are Not Alone, Michael," through a brother's eyes. Thankfully, none of us had a clue that Michael was due at a meeting that morning at the top of one of the Twin Towers. We only discovered this when Mother phoned his hotel to make sure he was okay. While Michael was on the phone after the attacks, he said to his mother, "I'm okay, thanks to you. You kept me talking so late that I overslept and missed my appointment." Michael Jackson would pass away from a cardiac arrest caused by a propofol overdose 8 years later. But is Michael's spirit at rest? In the coming weeks, we'll delve into that case with 3 celebrity ghosts, so make sure you subscribe so you don't miss that video. These celebrities got lucky on that tragic day, unlike so many other people who were killed or injured or had to endure losing a loved one. Even though it's incredible that in all these cases, these people were able to beat the odds and avoid tragedy, we must remember that not everyone was so lucky. So while it's important to recognize these remarkable stories, it's also important to remember those who didn't make it. Number 3. Killer King. In late 1980, author Stephen King was a well-respected and wildly popular horror writer living in Maine. Having already penned such now-classic novels as Carrie, The Stand, and The Shining, King was making the rounds to promote his latest book, Firestarter, when he murdered John Lennon. At least, that's the bonkers conspiracy theory celebrated by one Beatles fan named Steve Lightfoot. Lightfoot's obsession with proving the author shot the singer began shortly after Lennon's assassination on December 8, 1980. Lightfoot has never really given a good reason why he began to suspect that Stephen King killed John Lennon, other than the fact that 1980 Stephen King bore a passing resemblance to Lennon's convicted killer, Mark David Chapman. But Lightfoot doesn't rest the case on the physical similarities between the two men. On his website, LondonMurderTruth.com, he goes into great detail about how King pulled off the murder and exposes those who helped him cover it up, namely Dick Nixon and Ronnie Reagan. As Lightfoot likes to say, it's true or he'd sue. The key evidence, Lightfoot says, are the hidden codes found in the headlines of major news articles about Lennon before his death, specifically in Time magazine, Newsweek, and the New York Times. These codes, when deciphered, reveal a vast government plot to off John Lennon as payback for his anti-establishment views. In a way, Lightfoot isn't entirely out on a limb here. It has been well documented that the US government had tried to deport Lennon numerous times for his outspoken views on the Vietnam War. But according to Lightfoot, they decided to kill him rather than deal with the deportation. And that's where Stephen King comes in as the supposed trigger man. On his website, Lightfoot meticulously points out sections of interviews King gave before the killing that proves he was going to do it. He even cites what he calls confessions, passages King later wrote in his own books over the years, in which he admits to the crime. Then there's Lightfoot's claim that the author himself reached out to advise him he doesn't know the whole true story. To some, it sounds like another fella using the internet to forward a personal obsession. But Lightfoot has been on the King killed Lennon trip for years before the internet was around. Sightings of his remarkable van, festooned with headlines and messages, were celebrated around California during the 80s, and that's a tradition Lightfoot continues today, with a new van and an ad for his website, where he'd be happy to sell you a 24-page booklet that would allow the reader to crack the same headline codes he has. It all seems like kind of harmless and bemusing fun. But for Lightfoot, the conspiracy is no joke. Multiple reports have had Lightfoot showing up at Stephen King's book signings and public speaking events, following the author around to heckle him about the murder. Once, Lightfoot even got arrested. Said King in 1994, Stephen Lightfoot has been a stone in my shoe for a lot of years. But even now, with a new van and a new Stephen King book coming out, it doesn't seem like that stone is going to disappear anytime soon. Number 2. Avril Lavigne. Avril Lavigne was 16 when she signed her first recording contract. 2 years later, in 2002, her first album, Let Go, exploded onto the charts and cemented Avril in pop music history. But, according to one particularly wild conspiracy theory, it was all downhill for Avril from there. As the theory goes, Avril quickly grew weary of the constant touring and public appearances her new fame demanded. It was too much, too soon, and the teenager spiraled into a deep depression. She refused to be seen in public or do interviews and didn't want to be a pop star anymore. But with her album flying off the shelves, the record executives who signed her to the contract were left in a lurch. They had $1 million moneymaker in their pocket, but she wasn't cooperating, so, according to some, the executives pulled a page from the playbook of rock music's past. They hired a lookalike to impersonate Avril, to take over the job, and left the real Avril to herself, holed up in her mansion, until she eventually took her own life in 2003, leaving a young woman named Melissa Vandella to assume her life and career. Then, shortly before Avril supposedly died, Vandella was taught to sing and perform like Avril. Vandella was initially hired to be a body double and stand-in for Avril when it came to dealing with the paparazzi. The idea of a clandestine celebrity doppelganger swap is not new. The most famous example of this perhaps being the urban legend that Paul McCartney of the Beatles died in a car crash in 1966 during the height of Beatlemania, leaving executives no choice but to bring in a double of Paul to fill out the foursome. The Paul is dead theory gained traction in the late 60s and early 70s, particularly on college campuses, to the point that Life magazine devoted a cover story to it in 1969. In the article, McCartney himself, supposedly, is quoted as saying the theory was all bloody stupid. The people who are making up these rumors, he said, should worry about themselves instead of worrying whether I'm dead or not. There's not enough time in life. Apparently, there's one particular fellow in Brazil who didn't get McCartney's memo. After the release of Avril Lavigne's second album, 2004's Under My Skin, this Brazilian fan began to notice some peculiar differences in not only Avril's music, but with the singer herself. The fan launched a website called Avril Está Morta to prove a switch had been made. The most obvious difference, the site points out, is how the singer looked, speculating on plastic surgery, and citing sea changes in her fashion choices, going from t-shirts and jeans to midriff-bearing pop diva ensembles. Her voice, as well, sounded thinner than it had on her debut album, the theory states. And the new Avril was taller, thinner, and a completely different autograph than she used to have. In all, the Avril Está Morta website points out dozens of pieces of so-called evidence of this deception. Everything from cryptic song lyrics to media quotes, to carefully analyze photographs and frame-by-frame video analysis, all in the hopes of proving that the Avril Lavigne who still performs today is actually Melissa Vandella in disguise. All so the record company executives could milk further millions from its late cash cow. But what would a juicy conspiracy theory be without a firm denial from those supposedly involved in the secret plot? Well, the legend really got ahead of steam in 2011 and resurfaced with a vengeance in 2019, finally forcing the singer to respond to the quote, dumb internet rumor, unquote. It's so weird, she told Entertainment Weekly, so dumb, and so it seems complicated as well. Number 1. Radical Purge. It's the late 1960s in America, and everything is on the verge of fundamental change. Young people who picked up the name hippies and ran with it gathered in large protests all over the country, trying to put a stop to the war in Vietnam. But more than just stopping the war, they wanted to be heard. No longer those bucolic grade schoolers from the 1950s, the youth movement of the late 60s truly believes that if they band together, they can change the world. And they aren't alone in this belief. According to multiple biographies and even taped conversations, President Richard Nixon believed these rascally kids might be able to pull it off too, and he wasn't happy about it. So he called in FBI's J. Edgar Hoover to look into his so-called youth problem. Later, he called in CIA Director Dick Helms to do the same. And he called this domestic surveillance program the Houston Plan. Nixon's first target were those he considered spokespeople for this young generation. The entertainer radicals he believed were fueling the discontent in his nation. According to one theory, Nixon, Hoover, and Helms made enemies lists of those in show business who needed to be dealt with. They were hippie icons who spoke and sang about being up with free love and drugs and down with the government. People like guitar god Jimi Hendrix. Hendrix made a name for himself by powering out a rousing rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner at Woodstock in 1969. But by 1970, he got word that the feds were on his tail, so he booked it to London to hide out for a while. But it wasn't far enough, it seems. On September 17, 1970, Jimi Hendrix died of what officials called accidental asphyxiation. They concluded he choked on his own vomit after taking sleeping pills. He was 27 years old. Then, on October 4th, 1970, a mere 17 days after Hendrix's shocking death, with the hippies still mourning his son passing, rock and blues icon Janis Joplin was found dead on the floor of her hotel apartment. A staple of the hippie scene in San Francisco, the birthplace of the counterculture movement, Joplin had expounded on the benefits of free love and the use of narcotics to open one's mind to a free way of thinking. According to officials, Janis accidentally overdosed that night in her hotel room. Curiously, she was also 27 years old. Another voice of the youth movement silenced. At this point, even someone clouded in weed smoke would be able to notice the beginnings of a disturbing pattern, especially if one is given to paranoia and a keen distrust of the government. As the lead singer / slam poet for the iconic band The Doors, Jim Morrison grew up with this mentality. After all, he was a military brat, moving from naval base to naval base following his top-ranked father, who by 1970 was a rear admiral in the U.S. Navy. Perhaps with some inside information from his powerful dad, Jim saw the writing on the wall. After recording the Doors album, L.A. Woman, Jim got the hell out of Dodge. He left Hollywood and America and holed up in a Paris apartment with his girlfriend, Pamela. But he was hoping to escape the long-reaching tentacles of Nixon's anti-radical Houston Plan. He was dead wrong. On July 3, 1971, 9 months after the deaths of his friends Jimmy and Janis, Jim was found dead in his bathtub. The official cause of death was heart failure, brought on by a heroin overdose. No autopsy was performed. Strangely, Jim Morrison was also just 27 years old. Hendrix, Joplin, and Morrison, all outspoken critics of the war and outspoken proponents of the youth culture, all dead within 1 year. It's kind of hard to see how anyone wouldn't see a nefarious pattern in it all. Later, the release of extensive FBI files on all three singers bore out the idea that the feds were keeping an eye on them. Enter filmmaker Larry Buchanan. In 1984, he released a movie called Down on Us that first postulated the idea that the CIA and/or the FBI had Jimmy, Janis, and Jim all whacked, exterminating the three singers whom he called the Pied Pipers of rock. The movie was not well received. The New York Daily News called it, quote, the work of a Martian whose understanding of the counterculture comes from old issues of Life magazine, unquote. But it was apparently intriguing enough to spark a conspiracy theory nonetheless. And as with many intriguing conspiracy theories, other believers took the ball and ran with it. Eventually, this one grew out to add that because Morrison had been tipped off by his dad that the government was after him, he actually faked his own death in Paris and continued to live in France and later in New York, where he still lives today under the name William Lawyer. Either that or Morrison became a Catholic monk and died in a Spanish monastery in 1974. Some have gone even further, joining the red thin of yarn with so-called proof that the CIA created Charles Manson through brainwashing in order to give the counterculture a bad name in the minds of the American public. For his part, director Buchanan firmly believes that the events depicted in his film are true, telling the Phoenix Times in 1991, "It's a true story, absolutely. Nobody has ever challenged anything you see in the movie." And he's happy that at least it got people talking about the very idea of wide-reaching government conspiracies years before Oliver Stone. "We lit the fire," he said. Excuse the pun. Number 3. Dee Snider, Twisted Sister. Although he plays a larger-than-life tough guy on stage, rocker Dee Snider of Twisted Sister has a soft spot for his family. When he famously testified before Congress in 1985, Snider took time to point out that, quote, "I'm very lucky that I have a wife, Suzette, who I've been going with for 10 years now, who is the most incredible mother." So it's more than understandable that Dee and Suzette used to lean on each other and their 4 children after Suzette's brother, Vinny, was murdered in 2003. Vincent Gargiulo was found lying in a pool of blood at 30th Street and Broadway in Manhattan in August of that year. He had been shot in the face at close range. By many accounts, Gargiulo was a likable, personal, and pleasant fellow who might have fallen in with the wrong crowd. The type of crowd Martin Scorsese makes movies about. As such, witnesses were not forthcoming, and the NYPD detectives were having trouble narrowing in on a suspect. For half a decade, the Snider family waited for justice that would seemingly never come. For her part, Suzette was despondent since her little brother's death. Dee Snider said that she would roam aimlessly around the house, feeling helpless and angry about the murder. She was lost and preoccupied with the fact that no one had been arrested for the cold-blooded cold case in the years since it happened. Then Dee said that shortly after Finney's death, things started happening around the house. As quoted on the website southernprose.com, Dee tells of picture frames randomly falling off walls. "I'm not talking about 1 or 2 pictures," Dee said. "I'm talking about half a dozen or a dozen at a time." One night, Dee and Suzette returned home to hear the sound of a drum set being played in their son Cody's room. Dee called up to Cody to tell him they were home, but Cody surprised them by walking out of the kitchen. Said Dee, there was nobody else in the house. There was nobody there to play the drums. For his part, Dee Snider scoffed at any kind of paranormal activity being at the root of the weirdness. But Suzette believed it was something else. She believed that Vinny was trying to reach out to her from the afterlife to tell them something important. One night, as Dee related, he and Suzette were watching TV in bed when Suzette suddenly called out for Vinny to show her a sign that he was not resting in peace. They got their answer instantly. "It wasn't a delayed response," said Dee. "It was, Vinny, do something with the TV," and bam, it goes off. In hopes of putting Suzette's mind at ease, Dee hired a psychic to come to their house and give them a reading. Dee Snider's scholarly skepticism was on high as the psychic closed his eyes and scribbled a few words on a piece of paper. "It will all come out in the wash," is all the psychic said that Vinny had told him. But rather than finding comfort in the message, Suzette was incensed. What kind of message was that? Where was the anger and the injustice she knew Vinny must have been feeling? It will all come out of the wash. What did that even mean? Then in 2008, around the 5th anniversary of her brother's murder, Suzette Snyder got her answer. On September 4, 2008, a New York gym owner named Christian Tarantino was arrested for the murder of not only Vincent Gargiulio, but for those of 2 other men 14 years prior. DNA matching had tied Tarantino to the 1994 crime thanks to an unwashed mask allegedly used at the scene. But the clincher, according to the FBI, was a secret tape recording Vinny had made of Tarantino confessing to the earlier murders. When Vinny tried to blackmail Tarantino with the recording, however, Tarantino took out a contract on Vinny's life. But Vinny's secret tape recording was later mailed to the FBI, anonymously. In 2013, Christian Tarantino was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms in prison for all 3 murders, and according to Dee Snider, Vinny was finally able to rest in peace. My whole family saw it. We were in the house watching TV and we heard someone walking down the hall, Dee said. We look and see a man with dark hair. I go running to the hall, and there's nobody there. Dee and his family all agreed they had just seen Uncle Vinny leave for good. It was the last paranormal experience Dee Snider had with regard to his brother-in-law, but it made him a believer. I realized how ridiculously cynical I was being. I see it now for what it is, proof of a world beyond what we know. Number 2, Bret Michael, Poison. It was a cold and dreary January in 1984 in the small town of Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. And as he sat on the lumpy couch in his buddy's musty basement, 19-year-old Bret Syshak was at crossroads. One day earlier, Bret had watched as his family buried his paternal grandmother, Marie Hazel. Marie had been more than simply a doting grandmother, however. She had been Bret's hero. When Bret was 6, he was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. Although terrified by the prospect of giving himself daily insulin injections for the rest of his life, Bret could turn to his grandmother, a diabetic herself, who would teach Bret how to not only live with the diagnosis, but thrive in spite of it. So Marie's sudden passing had thrown Bret for a loop. At the funeral, I cried so hard that I could even walk into the room, he recalled. On top of that, Bret's grand plans for rock and roll stardom had gotten stuck in the ice. He found himself constantly broke and struggling to make ends meet. As he sat on the moldering couch, Bret wondered if it was the death of not only his grandmother, but his rock and roll dreams as well. Was he supposed to just give up? Grow content to spend the rest of his life in his tiny town playing weddings and pool halls with his high school band, Paris? And that's when it happened. As Bret told Celebrity Ghost Stories in 2011, I'm telling you right now, there was no rhyme or reason for it, but this ball of energy floated across the room. It crackled and glowed, he said, as it hovered across the basement towards him. But Bret's first response was not to see this glowing orb as a sign from his late grandmother. His first response, instead, was to get out of that basement. It was insane and scared the hell out of me, he said. Only later, while sitting in his frigid car, he didn't turn on the heat because he couldn't afford to waste the gas, did Bret realize that what he'd just experienced might have been the sign he was looking for. That night, Bret went to his band's gig at the Fishing Creek Community Center. After the show, he told the other 3 he was done. He was going out to Los Angeles, California to follow his dream, and they could come with him or consider this the end of Paris. 2 of his bandmates opted out, but Bret's drummer, Richard Ream, decided to go with him. They left, he said, 6 hours later, driving an old ambulance van and carrying $800 in crumpled bills. Once in LA, Bret Syshak started going by his middle name, becoming Bret Michaels, while Richard Ream adopted the stage name Ricky Rocket, and their band, Paris, became Poison. Within a year of coming to California, Bret Michaels was strutting his stuff across stages up and down Hollywood's famed Sunset Strip. A record deal soon followed, which led to a smash hit record, Talk Dirty to Me, and eventual music video immortality on MTV. All within 2 years of that strange experience on his buddy's basement couch. In the early 1990s, Bret was standing on the balcony of his Malibu beach home. The $1 million view that evening included a particularly beautiful sunset over the Pacific Ocean. As he watched the sun go down, with his model girlfriend by his side, Brett marveled at how far he had come from Mechanicsburg. He probably wondered what his grandmother would think of all this had she been around to see it. Brett's girlfriend went downstairs into the house as Brett watched the last of the sunset. But as he leaned on the railing, the sun's glow bathing him in an orange light, he felt a pair of arms envelop him from behind. It was a warm feeling, he said later, almost like a friend. Thinking it was his girlfriend, Brett turned around only to come face to face with his grandmother. Then in a blink, she was gone. Brett went on to say that he firmly believes that his grandmother came back to tell him how proud she was of her grandson, and to tell him she was his guardian angel. Said Brett Michaels, "Maybe, just maybe, what haunted me and scared me in that basement is also what motivated me throughout my life." Number 1. Vince Neil, Motley Crue. In 1969, in a Life magazine article about the budding counterculture, writer Edward Kern coined the phrase, "sex, drugs, and rock and roll." The term became an anthem call for rock stars, and few people lived up to its ideals more than Motley Crue lead singer Vince Neil. But in 1984, at the height of his band's success, Neil was involved in a fatal car crash that claimed the life of fellow rocker Razzle Dingley of the group Hanoi Rocks. Neil walked away from the crash, or perhaps stumbled away. His police at the time said Neil was driving very, very drunk. Yet, despite his laughably light sentence for Dingley's death, Neil didn't take the crash as a sign to clean up. After the crash, Neil's rampant drug and alcohol use, by his own admission, only got worse. Along with those hedonistic ways came the darkness, a heaviness that always seemed to follow him. In the late 1980s, Neil was living in a mansion in Bell Canyon, California, with his second wife, Charisse. The only problem was that the house was haunted, Neil wrote in his 2010 autobiography, Tattoos and Tequila. Aside from the usual spooky stuff, weird sounds, the dog barking at nothing, Neil relates a story that terrified him and Charisse. One night, Charisse was in bed and heard a baby crying in the corner, Neil wrote, which was strange because the couple had no children. 2 children from Neil's previous relationships were, at the time, ages 10 and 4, and didn't live in the house with him. So Charisse was terrified to hear the baby crying, and she didn't want to look in the corner where the sound was coming from. That's when, according to Neil, she felt a hand turn her face towards the direction where the sound was coming from, where the baby was, actually, physically turning her face. Vince and Charisse moved out of the mansion shortly afterward and settled in Malibu. By 1990, Vince Neil was on top of the world. He had just come back from a record-breaking Dr. Feelgood world tour with Tommy Lee and Company. And he was feeling so fulfilled both financially and creatively that he and Charisse decided to start a family. Their daughter, Skylar Neil, was born on March 26, 1991. And though Neil was determined to be a better dad than he had been to his 2 older children, he only ended up doubling down on his sex, drugs, and rock and roll lifestyle. His drinking and drug use escalated. There were affairs with various models, Malibu bar fights, and extended periods of just not coming home to his wife and daughter. Unsurprisingly, he and Charisse soon divorced. A judge gave Neil visitation rights to 3-year-old Skylar, who would visit her dad at his hotel room, and the heaviness continued. The September 1991 release of Nirvana's Nevermind album pretty much sealed the tomb of 80s hair metal bands and kicked off the grunge era. Motley Crue broke up a year later, and Neil and his bandmates entered into protracted lawsuits against one another. Then Neil's plans to put out a solo album weren't coming along as he'd hoped. A new record sold less than 100,000 copies. A record executive's son overdosed in Neil's bathroom. Warner Brothers released Neil from his recording contract. And then Charisse called Neil to tell him even more bad news. The worst news. "Skylar's in the hospital," she said. As Vince and Charisse looked over Skylar's hospital bed, they were convinced it was the flu, or her appendix. But the doctors revealed the 4-year-old had a massive tumor in her abdomen, and it burst, sending cancer across her little body. 6 operations failed to save her. As Neil writes, the hurt and pain was more than I could take. I felt like God was punishing me. I know I've done a lot of bad stuff in my life, but why take my little girl? What had she done to anyone? After Skylar's death, Neil found himself on a downward spiral. My drinking got steadily worse, he writes. Plus, I had pills, any kind I could get my hands on. Vince Neil was on a dark train, and the next stop, he admits, was oblivion. Though he tried to clean up with half a dozen stints in various rehabs, his heart simply wasn't in it. I wanted to die, he writes. I felt Skylar was waiting for me, and the only place I wanted to go was to her. Then one night, about 2 years after his daughter's death, Neil says he was passed out in bed when he felt a presence in his room. Something tugged on his bed covers, and he sat bolt upright, despite his sorry state. Though terrified by what had happened, Neil said he knew immediately it was Skylar. I didn't know what was going on, he later said, but it was her. Over the next 2 weeks, Neil felt Skylar's presence with him every day, and her being with him helped clean up his act. Another stint in rehab seemed to stick. In the later 1990s, Motley Crue reunited, and Vince got married to his third wife, Heidi Mark. And Neil started a charity called the Skylar Neil Foundation, which has raised millions of dollars for cancer research, while helping furnish hospitals with toys and TVs for children in treatment. Though Neil admits he still struggles with alcohol addiction, he isn't on that hell-bent path towards oblivion anymore. It's kind of funny, he writes, that it takes a death of someone close to you, or some other kind of tragedy, to make you appreciate what you have in life. A life, he says, his daughter's spirit helped to save. Celebrities find their way into our homes through magazines, social media, television, and movies. We watch their interviews, look at their pictures, and enjoy their work. It's almost like we know them because we create parasocial relationships with them, and it seems like for many, these relationships carry on even after the celebrity passes away. Number 3. Lucille Ball. Lucille Ball was a groundbreaking comedian and actor who enjoyed a very successful career with her notable television sitcom I Love Lucy, which aired in 1951 and continued for 6 seasons. The show also starred her husband at the time, Desi Arnaz, as her husband on the show. After bringing joy to many people in their homes over the years, it seems that Lucille Ball wanted to continue doing so even after her death. Ball was born in Jamestown, New York, on August 6, 1911. Her father died of typhoid fever in February 1915 when Ball was only 3 years old. Her mother remarried, and her new husband, Ball's stepfather, wasn't enthusiastic about having 2 young children, so Ball and her brother were each sent to live with different sets of their grandparents. Ball's brother was sent to live with their maternal grandparents, and Ball was placed with her stepfather's parents. Ball's childhood was difficult. He returned to live with her mother and stepfather at age 11. Ball's love for the stage began early in life, and she took drama classes when she was 15 years old. Her career sort of took off first as a model. Like many young, unknown actors, Ball had difficulty booking jobs, so modeling served as a way to pay the bills and get exposure. She used the name Diane Belmont for this part of her career. Fortunately, she was seen on a poster and soon started booking actual acting jobs. Ball's film career had highs and lows. She had the unofficial title of the Queen of the B-movies. Movie theaters used to show double or even triple features, so for one ticket, people could see 2 or 3 movies. It was usually a main attraction, considered the A movie, and then a low-budget film called the B movie that played before it. Ball started many of these low-budget comedies that played before the movies considered the main attraction. Some of these included Stage Door in 1937 and Too Many Girls in 1940. She made 72 films throughout her career. She was not only finding acting success in B-movies, but also love. The film Too Many Girls featured actor Desi Arnaz. The two got married in 1940. Along with the B-movies, Ball also had several roles in some main attractions, including The Big Street in 1942, Ziegfeld Follies in 1946, and Fancy Pants in 1950. You're probably thinking, I don't know about these movies. I know her from I Love Lucy. And there'll be a reason for that. That's because it's undoubtedly her most famous role. This is how it happened. In 1942, Ball was working on the radio show My Favorite Husband. It was like a TV show, but only on the radio, so to explain this to kids, it's like a podcast. CBS heard the show and they were impressed with Ball. They wanted her to star in her own show on the network. Ball was excited by the opportunity, but wanted her real-life husband, Arnaz, to play her husband on the show. Of course, due to racism, as Arnaz was Cuban, the network was worried that their interracial relationship wouldn't work for their audience. So Arnaz and Ball decided to do their own show and make a vaudeville act together. CBS eventually came back and said that they did want them on the show, even if they were in an interracial marriage. I Love Lucy was a smash hit and revolutionary in many ways. Ball and Arnaz were the first interracial couple on television. They also had a 6-year age gap, Ball being older. It would have been shocking if people knew, but they lied on their wedding certificate. And they were the first show to have a pregnant woman in the lead, even though they weren't allowed to use the word pregnant in the episode. That's a true story. The show also had technical achievements. They were the first to use multi-camera film styling, which Arnaz developed with a camera crew, and it's still used today for many sitcoms. The show was a critical success, winning 5 Emmys during its 6-year run. Audiences loved I Love Lucy too. For 4 seasons, it was the #1 show in the United States. In hindsight, given the success of the show at the time and its enduring legacy, it would seem like CBS's initial concerns were misplaced. Together, Ball and Arnaz created Desilu Productions in 1950 and made other shows after I Love Lucy, which included The Dick Van Dyke Show and Star Trek. Another way that Ball altered people's expectation of women was when she and Arnaz divorced, and she bought him out of Desilu Productions. She became the first woman to run a major television production studio. Lucille Ball had an interesting, revolutionary, and creative life that sadly ended on April 6, 1989, when she died of a ruptured aorta following open-heart surgery. She was 77 years old. But it seems that her desire and love for entertaining was so strong that it brought her out of her grave. Ball's ghost has been seen in the location of her mansion in Beverly Hills and at the Paramount Studios lot. Her Beverly Hills home was demolished after she died, and her friend was at the construction site while there were still parts of the building intact. He said he saw her standing in her old bedroom, and she even looked at him. She appeared sad and then walked away and disappeared. Some people have said that there are unexplained noises in the attic of the newly constructed house. Sometimes it sounds like someone's moving items around or throwing a party. On occasion, when people go to the attic, they notice things are misplaced and are found in different spots than where they were previously. There have also been reports that the theme song to her show, I Love Lucy, will play in the attic. Others have reported hearing footsteps between the bedroom and her office throughout the day and night, which is something that was usual for Ball during her lifetime. Some have reported seeing her at the Paramount Studios lot, specifically the Hart Building, where she worked. Some people have smelled her perfume and noticed lights turning on and off. Some have even reported seeing her there. Ball reportedly worked very late at night at the studios throughout her career. It seems that Ball is doing in the afterlife what she loved doing so much in her actual life. She likes to keep people guessing, entertain, and she loves her work. She was passionate about her show, so her enduring presence at the studio lot isn't surprising. Many have said that her ghost is playful and plays jokes. It seems like Lucille Ball doesn't want to leave the stage. Number 2. Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson, also known as the King of Pop, had a long, illustrious career that changed pop music forever. His legacy is complicated. He has given the world some of the best and most beloved hits ever, but the disturbing accusations of child molestation against him have always cast a dark shadow. Jackson was born on August 29, 1958 in Gary, Indiana. Jackson had 9 siblings, which included 3 sisters and 6 brothers. His career began at the young age of 5 when he and his 4 brothers joined together to create the Jackson 5. They soon began serving as the opening acts for Gladys Knight and the Pips and James Brown, among other stars. In 1969, Berry Gordy, Motown Records founder, signed them to their own contract. The Jackson 5 became known for hits including I Want You Back, ABC, and Blame It on the Boogie. Michael was the undeniable breakout star of the group and ended up going solo, releasing albums that included hit after hit. These included 1979's Off the Wall, which included songs like Don't Stop Till You Get Enough and She's Out My Life. This was followed up by the monstrously successful album Thriller in 1982. Thriller received 12 Grammy nominations and 8 wins. The album includes mega hits like Billie Jean, Thriller, and Beat It. It is, by far, the best-selling album of all time. Arguably, nearly everyone has a favorite Michael Jackson song. His impact on pop culture is indisputable, but his personal life has always been a topic of conversation. He married Lisa Marie Presley, daughter of Elvis Presley, in 1994. The marriage was short-lived and they divorced in 1996. That same year, Jackson married his second wife, Debbie Rowe. Together, they had 2 of Jackson's 3 children, Michael Joseph Prince Jackson Jr. in 1997 and Paris Michael Catherine Jackson in 1998. Rowe and Jackson divorced in 1999. Jackson then had a 3rd child with a surrogate named Prince Michael Blanket Jackson II. As with much of his private life, there's a lot of controversy surrounding the paternity of the children. Accusations of child molestation soon became as well known as the songs when it was reported he often slept in the same bed as children. Several people have claimed that Jackson molested them over a long period. Michael Jackson died in June 2009 at the age of 50. He had plans to start This Is It tour in July of 2009, which had already sold out. Initially, his death was ruled to be a cardiac arrest. In February 2010, the exact cause of death was changed to acute propofol intoxication or a lethal overdose of prescription drugs. The doctor who administered the drugs was Dr. Conrad Murray, and he was convicted of involuntary manslaughter on November 7, 2011. He wasn't licensed to prescribe most controlled substances in California, and he didn't have the proper equipment to administer propofol. Jackson had a short, eventful, and impactful life, and there's no wonder that he's still impacting people's lives today, specifically the life of Kathleen Roberts. Kathleen Roberts, who is under the impression that she is, in fact, the reincarnation of Marilyn Monroe, said that she is married to Michael Jackson. She's the Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., yes, the civil rights leader who was assassinated in 1968, so you know, is also dead, officiated their wedding ceremony. She believes that Jackson is always inside her body, and she said of their relationship, "I feel special that he chose me for a wife, though not on paper. We treat our relationship as though we are married. We have our ups and downs, but Jackson, the truth is, I can't stop loving you." Yes, she quoted the song at the end there. According to Roberts, Jackson loves cookies, he's a big talker, and a big swearer. However, the relationship isn't physical. Although Jackson lives his afterlife by channeling through Roberts, she says he doesn't like touching her. She said that if she tries to become physical with him, he scares me with spider visions and dead corpse visions if I kiss him or try to initiate romance physically. Could he just say he has a headache when he's not in the mood like everyone else? Well, Michael Jackson wasn't like everyone else in real life, so why would his ghost be? The story is certainly strange, but Jackson lived many strange moments in his life, so this may be the perfect fit for him. Aside from Roberts, many have claimed to see the shadow of Jackson during a Larry King special on CNN called Inside Neverland. King was speaking with Jackson's brother, Jermaine Jackson, when it seemed like there was a shadow at the end of the hallway. Many think it's Michael Jackson who is haunting the estate, which is why there was so much difficulty in selling the property. Many people who worked at Neverland have also reported seeing his ghost around the grounds as well. It would seem that Michael Jackson's time on Earth is not yet complete, but he's choosing strange vessels to make his presence known, but we suppose that's to be expected from him. Number 1. Sharon Tate. Sharon Tate was born on January 24, 1943, and was murdered on August 9, 1969. She was pregnant with her first child when she was murdered. Tate was a beautiful woman with a budding acting career, and it ended too early in an ugly way. Tate began her career as a model, and she also did beauty pageants. She became an actor after doing commercials and had her big breakout role in the film Valley of the Dolls in 1967. She was the second wife of film director Roman Polanski, who had his own traumatic childhood in Poland. He escaped being sent to a Nazi concentration camp. He bounced between families who tried hiding him and roamed the countryside. Both of his parents were sent to Nazi concentration camps. His father survived, but his mother did not. In the 1960s, he became a renowned film director. Tate and Polanski married in England in 1968, and Tate soon became pregnant. Their marriage was fraught with infidelity on the part of Polanski, and some argued that her pregnancy was a last-ditch effort to save and fix their marriage. In the summer of 1969, they moved to 10,050 Cielo Drive in Los Angeles, California. They were renting the home, and at the time of the murders, Polanski was in Europe. Wojciech Frykowski and his girlfriend, Abigail Folger, were staying with Tate while Polanski was in Europe. Tate's friend and former lover, Jay Sebring, was there on the night of the murders, and Stephen Perrin was an 18-year-old who was visiting his friend who lived in the guest house. On that fateful night of August 8, 1969, Charles Manson, the head of the Manson family, ordered Charles Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Caspian to go to 10,050 Cielo Drive and kill everyone in the house. One of the most disturbing aspects of the ordeal was that no one at Cielo Drive that day was involved with anyone in the Manson family. The previous resident, Terry Melcher, was acquainted with Charles Manson. Melcher was a music producer, and he and Manson had discussed the possibility of a recording contract, but the deal never happened. Everyone at the house that night, as well as Stephen Parent, were killed that night. Seeing as this was such a gruesome act, it's no wonder people have eerie feelings about this particular residence. Ted herself saw a ghost the day before the attack. She said she saw someone tied to the staircase with their throat cut open. Was it a premonition of what was to come, or a sign that there was already a ghostly presence at the house? If you want to hear more about this story, please check out our video, 3 Hollywood Hauntings. The original mansion at Cielo Drive, where the massacre happened, was demolished in 1994, so you think the otherworldly elements would be gone, but that's not the case. David Oman began building a house close to where the old Cielo Drive mansion was located in 1999, and it would seem bizarre happenings began immediately, even during the construction phase. There were your normal paranormal events like people hearing voices, objects falling without any particular reason to fall, lights turning on and off, shadows are seen, doors closing, and cold breezes on people's neck. But then there were less run-of-the-mill paranormal activity. In 2004, Oman woke up at 2 a.m. and saw a full body of a ghost. This ghost was a man, and he was standing at the head of Oman's bed, and he was pointing. It turns out that he was pointing towards the driveway that leads to, you guessed it, the old 10,050 Cielo Drive property. Then the ghost just disappeared. Oman tried to investigate the incident and went to the LAPD. He thought he might be able to find something from that night. He saw a picture of Jay Sebring, Tate's friend, who was also murdered that night, and he recognized him because he looked like the ghost he had seen. Owen's house has become a must-see location for those interested in paranormal investigations and ghostly encounters. One parapsychologist, Barry Taff, said of the 4,000 cases he's participated in, Owen's house has the highest consistent EMF reading. Owen said that he once had people over and everyone sat at the table. He said he heard the voice of who he assumed was Tate, and the voice whispered, "I just want you to know, we're here." Owen stated that he's had several mediums at his home, and they claim that the spirits of those who were murdered that night will remain until those who participated in the murders die themselves. It seems that many of these celebrity ghosts have found themselves caught between two worlds. Some are there to entertain, others are there to watch that justice is done. Ultimately, it would seem that none of these ghosts are malicious in their presence, and maybe it's just time we learn to live with them and accept them in our world. Thank you so much for watching this video. We hope you found it interesting. If you did find it interesting, please make sure you subscribe. We'll have a new video about the paranormal every week. If you just discovered this channel, please make sure you check out our other channel, Criminally Listed. We have over 325 videos featuring bizarre but true crime stories. You can find it at youtube.com/criminallylisted. We also have a podcast about cold cases that were eventually solved called Criminally Listed Presents Into the Killing. You can find it on Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, and anywhere you find great podcasts. But that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.